So I want to talk to you guys about this peace plan that the Wall Street Journal has published. For those of you who don't remember, because this war has been going on for a bit now, we're now going on year 3 in this 3-day military operation. During the start of the war, there was a lot of talk through back channels, not necessarily directly. There wasn't, Putin and Zelensky weren't exactly chit-chatting over tea. There were a lot of talks through back channels and intermediaries over a potential peace deal that could see the cessation of hostilities. And this went on through March and April before wildly starting to die down afterwards as it all kind of fell apart. Now, there's a huge debate about the intentions behind said negotiations. So before we even talk about what this peace plan is, and it is truly incredible that we now have this out. This is the first time we've gotten a real clear picture of what the specifics would be in this early peace deal that was being negotiated by intermediaries through back channels in places like Istanbul and other places. And that's also really important because we've heard so much speculation about this, about it getting sunk by Boris Johnson, and it was a great deal and all the wars could have been avoided if they just took this amazing, fantastic, and beautiful peace deal at the early stage. So being able to know the specifics is great for the historiography. I honestly didn't think we would know this until after the war was over. So this is special that we have access to this, but I do need to just tell you guys that we don't know what the intention of Russian negotiations were. We can accept at face value that they were generally interested in negotiating a deal. We could also maybe try to interpret it as, oh, they were maybe okay with semi-deal, but they were going to keep pushing. Or, and this is what many Ukrainians believe, and of course, we don't know the specifics. We can't assume intention, so this is all up to interpretation, that it was all a delaying tactic, that all this discussion was just meant to give the Russians an opportunity to keep trying to push towards Kiev, which they did through March and towards the beginning of April, or try to grab as much land as they can before they eventually have to settle down and actually write down a deal. So whether it was meant to see how quickly they could enter negotiations, whether we see, oh, we'll drag this out and then we'll enter negotiations after time. Oh, this was all a facade and this was meant to distract the Ukrainians and keep them hopeful and keep the West from sending large amounts of aid. If they think a peace deal is around the corner, there's no need to send Ukraine F-16s. If you think a peace deal is around the corner, why send tanks? Why send Taurus missiles? Why send ATACMS? Why send HIMARS? Why send cluster bombs or artillery shells? Why send everything if peace is right around the corner? So we're going to read this and we're going to talk about the specifics, but I just wanted to put at the start that we still don't know the intentions, the political intricacies, and with this now we just have an idea of the specifics of what was being negotiated, not the intentions of the negotiators. I just wanted to make sure for you guys to keep that perspective in mind. Okay, let's read. A peace plan proposal drafted during the Russian-Ukrainian negotiations in 2022 would see Ukraine turned into a militarily neutered country. Now, we're reading the Kiev Independent Summary, but to be clear, the Wall Street Journal original article put this as the subtext, there was the title and then there was the text under the title, and this is the language they used. So the Western outlet said it would turn Ukraine into a militarily neutered country, and the Kiev Independent, the Ukrainian-based outlet, said it would turn them into a militarily neutered country. Permanently vulnerable to Russian aggression, the Wall Street Journal reported on March 1st after reviewing the document. Listen to that. Permanently vulnerable to Russian aggression. This will become clear in a second why. The proposal illustrates the tough concessions Kiev would have had to take to conclude the 2022 talks, which ultimately failed as Ukraine began turning the tide in the war and Western support poured in. According to the Wall Street Journal, Moscow plans had largely remained the same, as Ukraine faces an increasingly precarious position in the war, compared by some to the first days of the full-scale invasion. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin allegedly signaled a willingness to restart peace talks on his terms. Allegedly, we don't know for sure. It was through anonymous Russian government sources to Western outlets. We don't know what that means. We don't know who they were. We don't know their intentions. We don't know if, again, it was just to make the West like, oh, during debates about whether they should send aid, oh, maybe we should just talk instead of sending aid, which would put Ukraine in a worse negotiating position. Even if you wanted to talk, you would want to send aid to be in a good negotiating position while you talk. But again, we don't know. Could be, could not. Just want to give that context. According to the 17-page document dated April 15th, 2022, Ukraine would be allowed to seek EU membership Okay, so they'd be allowed to seek EU membership. That is something that they've been fighting for since 2014. That is something that is still a divisive issue even within the EU, as we're seeing the Ukrainians and the Poles butt heads over grain exports. But this is something that you could say would be good for the Ukrainians, but not entry to NATO or any other military bloc. So this would stop not only NATO membership, but let's say some subsidiary or some other kind of offshoot that could be created in order to make it so that, other nations would, jump to their assistance in some sort of military alliance. So this would stop Ukraine's other big ambition of them wanting to join NATO, so that if the Russians invaded them again, they would have a big alliance to defend them, and it would act as a deterrent, almost certainly stopping Russian invasion. Deterring Russian invasion. Ukraine's armed forces would have to be reduced to a certain size. Now, this right here is really interesting. We're going to talk about it in a second once we read the numbers. No foreign weapons would be stationed on its territory, and Crimea would remain de facto in Russian hands. Russia would see Ukrainian forces limited to 85,000 troops, 342 tanks, 519 artillery pieces, while Ukrainian negotiators wanted 250,000 troops, 800 tanks, 1,900 artillery pieces, according to the document. Russia also reportedly wanted to limit the range of Ukrainian missiles to 25 miles. Now, currently, for reference, the Ukrainians can send drones after 2 years of war that can go as far as St. Petersburg, 1,250 kilometers away. So this would be it'd be a stark difference to what abilities they have now. Moscow pushed for the Russian language to be treated on par with the Ukrainian one in Ukraine's government and courts, a condition that the Ukrainian negotiators also did not agree with. The status of eastern regions occupied by Russia since 2014 was to be agreed upon in a meeting between Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky and Putin, and this meeting did not take place. And this is an indicator, and we're going to talk about the specifics of this in a moment. This is an indicator that the talks were not that far along, because if that was going to be determined by another conversation and that conversation didn't happen, we already knew this was all being done by back channels and intermediaries. It's just an indicator that it wasn't that far along. But it also indicates that the Russians probably, and this is just me, of course, speculating, but I think from their actions, I think it's shown, they probably would not have been satisfied with just Crimea and would not accept, oh, okay, you know what, we'll give you everything else back if you just accept Crimea. There's a decent reason they're also going to ask for Donetsk. They're also going to ask for Luhansk. And now, 2 years later, there's probably a lot more territory. And there might have even been more, since it's saying eastern regions, right? Who knows how if it would have been spanning more if their troops are taking cities like Kherson, and the Russians believe that they're Russian cities. The treaty would be guaranteed by foreign powers, including the US, the UK, China, France, and Russia. These countries would be given responsibility to defend Ukraine's neutrality if it were violated, the Wall Street Journal wrote. Russia reportedly aimed to add Belarus to the list of guarantors, while Ukraine wanted to include Turkey. Ukraine had previously received similar assurances from Russia, the US, and the UK in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which called for international assistance if Ukraine should become a victim of an act of aggression in exchange for the country relinquishing its nuclear arsenal. Russia broke this treaty in 2014 by illegally occupying Crimea and Donbass. Okay, now we've gone through this. Now at the end, it talks about other peace models like the 10-point peace plan that the Ukrainians have put forward, and they're trying to have summits around. Man, it is, again, I just want to say it is so good that we have some specifics now, because every time I would talk to people about Boris Johnson sinking a peace deal, which we don't know happened, but people say happened based off of a single Pravda report, and based off of, I think it's a Pravda report, and I think just the Prime Minister of Israel statements, but even the Prime Minister of Israel's former clarified that not a lot of context was given. And there's been books published like this one, which I highly recommend, Our Enemies Will Vanish, that undercuts the idea that the Westerners kind of walked in and then just convinced the Ukrainians to keep fighting and stop them from making a peace deal. And I think this shows a lot of how the Ukrainians probably were not too happy with this peace deal. Now, I mean, there's a lot to go through here. Number one, Crimea would remain in Russian hands. This is something the Ukrainians still don't accept today, and that would be something they probably wouldn't want to accept then. But then again, they were holding on to it before. Maybe it's something you could force upon them in the situation, and they might, maybe even under some pressure, be able to give that up. Who knows? Is it possible to say? I wouldn't know. We'd have to go back in time and change the situation. But that's already something that's going to be very painful for Ukrainians to give up. They didn't want to give it up in the 8 years before, and they haven't wanted to give it up in the 2 years after. No foreign weapons would be stationed on its territory. So anything like, you know, the air defense systems that have flooded into Ukraine since then, you know, different tank systems, all this different stuff that has helped Ukraine defend itself, that type of stuff cannot be sent. No Javelins, no HIMARS, no Patriots air defense. These things that have helped Ukraine defend itself, that cannot be sent. And this is there's already the block of NATO membership here too as well, which means that while it would also not be getting foreign weapons, it would not have any other foreign army necessarily coming to its defense in a military block if it was to get invaded again. And the big kicker here is I mean, I'm not going to go through the tank. I mean, we can go through the specifics here actually. 85,000 troop limit. 85,000 troop limit. Now, every single thing here is massively reduced. To be clear, the Ukrainians were even willing to somewhat entertain this. The Ukrainians had 300,000 soldiers going into the war at the start of this. Now, of course, a lot of those soldiers are not like of the most top tier crop. A lot of them actually were. They were more professional soldiers, but a lot of those numbers are not like, oh, these are all special ops. Some of them are going to be border patrol, but they had a force of 300,000. 300,000. And they're willing to say, fine, 50,000 troops taken off the board. We'll do 250,000. And they'll limit their tanks more. They'll limit their artillery pieces. But no, what the Russians wanted was them to reduce their army from 300,000 troops after the Ukrainians know that the Russians have now invaded them for the second time in 8 years, from 300,000 troops to 85,000 troops. From the amount of tanks they have in reserves and all the tanks they have, from the Ukrainians saying, no, 800 tanks or more, to 342 tanks. 342 tanks. To be clear, the Russians have lost like 6, 7, 8 times this in this war. To give you an idea of how few tanks that is in comparison to the army that would be invading them. And 519 artillery pieces, compared to the 1,900 the Ukrainian negotiators were asking for. Again, they're fighting potentially in a war with the Russian army. The Russian army is an extremely artillery-intensive machine. If you look at locations like Bakhmut and Mariupol and all these cities that have been completely wiped off the maps, Popasna, I know, that city, the Russians completely demolished to the point they said they're not even going to bother rebuilding it because the whole city's literally gone. The reason those cities are literally gone is because of how much they've used artillery. Glide bombs can do a lot of damage too, but this war has been dominated by artillery at every aspect. And so them asking for this limit on artillery pieces shows that they want to have the advantage in tanks over the Ukrainians, they want to have the advantage over artillery over the Ukrainians, and they want to have the advantage over troops over the Ukrainians. Now, the thing is, they already had all of that. But the thing is, with 300,000 troops, as we've now seen, they could potentially, which they did, stop the Russians from taking Kiev very rapidly. But if they can limit their army to 85,000 troops instead of 300,000, then trying to stop Kiev from being captured, or trying to stop any other eastern Ukrainian territories from being captured, or any other army, or any other area of the country from being captured, is going to be extremely difficult because they've completely crippled themselves. Let me just be blunt, because I could go through like I don't want to do any war planning. If the Ukrainians agreed to this army size and they fought a mobilized Russia, or not even a fully mobilized Russia, a semi-mobilized Russia, maybe just like Russia's just standard army, maybe even, it's going to be extremely difficult to, if not impossible, especially if Russia's mobilized, and it would be impossible for them to hold up against the Russian army, even if all of their tactics was defensive. They wouldn't have enough manpower, they wouldn't have enough tanks, they wouldn't have enough artillery pieces, and they would be unable to bring in foreign weapons to supplement themselves. Foreign weapons where they can maybe make it so, okay, we have 85,000 troops, but we're going to make sure that every one of those soldiers are top tier, so that, no, well, if you can't import the foreign weapons with the foreign components, that might, you know, allow them to try to take advantage of every soldier. No, you can't do that either. What the Russians wanted was for not only for them to solidify their hold over Crimea, not only for them to most likely, almost certainly, solidify their control of eastern Ukrainian land and take more of it, but also make it so that if Ukraine ever thought of directly objecting to Russian demands in the future, knowing that it would have some hard power behind it, they won't know that anymore. They won't have that anymore. So all the Russians need to do is flex a little bit and the Ukrainians yield. And if the Ukrainians ever get the idea that maybe, you know what, they don't like this trade deal that 100% benefits the Russians, they don't like this thing that the Russians are asking of them, or, hey, they're actually unsatisfied with this deal and they want to renegotiate it, and they say, no, we no longer accept it, well, what is 85,000 troops going to do against the entirety of the Russian armed forces? They were and then this isn't, and again, this is just part of it. They also want to limit it so the Ukrainians basically can't strike inside of Russia. So if Ukrainians were invaded, they would have 85,000 troops as a troop limit, around 300 tanks, 500 artillery pieces, and all their missiles can only hit 25 miles deep. So they can't attack Russian logistics. They can't attack Russian air bases where they're going to be launching glide bombs or missiles from. They can't attack their ships. So they know things like sinking the Moskva. What Russia wants in order for it to feel safe in this deal is a Ukraine where at any point they could go in and curb stomp it and there's nothing they could do. And they want the Ukrainians to agree to it after the Russians have attempted to curb stomp them twice in a row. While during the curb stomping or attempted curb stompings, they said the whole time, no, we're not doing it. I don't know what you're talking about. And they're supposed to take the Russians on their word. If you accepted this plan, you would have to hope that the Russians would abide by it. You would deal with the fact that many people who were displaced from occupied territories would not be able to return home. There would be no defensive pact stopping people from invading you, no big deterrence that has been added that had fundamentally changed the equation to make this peace deal hold up different than the other 20 negotiated ceasefires after the 200 rounds of negotiation leading in to the 2022 large-scale invasion. And even on top of all this, still, the Russian language must be established. Russia must continue to push its language inside of Ukraine. Ukraine can't decide its own language laws for its own country. They must also accept the Russian language. Now, I would be fine with this if also in Russia, they also teach Ukraine as the official language, and they teach Ukraine in all their schools. How many Ukrainian language schools are there in Russia? Can anybody tell me? How many Ukrainian language schools are in Moscow? How many Ukrainian language schools are in St. Petersburg? How many Ukrainian language schools are in Eastern Siberia? Does anybody know? -7. Okay, that's how many Ukrainian language schools are throughout Russia. Point is dominating the language, dominating the armed forces, dominating their defensive pacts, and making them a neutral state so it could not maneuver diplomatically if the Russians were to assert dominance again. And like, this doesn't even fully clarify exactly what eastern regions the Russians would be taking. And imagine that if you're Zelensky and you're looking at this deal and you still don't even know what eastern regions, you give up your armed forces, you give up your missiles, you give up your ability to maneuver around diplomatically, you give up your sovereignty over your language, you give up all these things, declare yourself neutral, and you still don't know if you're going to get the eastern Ukrainian regions back, because the Russian army, while these talks are going on, are continuing to advance. You know, when the talks started in March, that's when they captured Kherson. That's also when they tried to march on Mykolaiv and capture Mykolaiv, but were stopped. And then they tried to turn around and march on Kiev. When these talks were starting, the Battle of Kiev was still ongoing. Mass graves were being uncovered. It's part of the reason the talks fell through. And so you're Zelensky already having to give all this up. And there's a good chance, even if you sign it and agree to it, the Russians might be like, oh, no. We just don't want the 1/3 of Donetsk and Luhansk, which we held before 2014. We're taking the rest of it. Give us the rest of Donetsk and give us the rest of Luhansk. You got to expel all, you got to tell all those people in Kramatorsk, they got to skedaddle. And you just hear Kherson got captured. Does that mean also they're going to keep Kherson? I think a lot of people, if they read this plan right here, who have been saying that, oh, the Westerners forced the Ukrainians to keep fighting and we convinced them to keep going when peace was in sight. Every single one of those people have to be forced to read this on their screen, on their stream, forced to read this on their show, forced to publish this in their publications, tweet it out, put it on Instagram, put it on MySpace, I don't care where, and answer for why this is something the Ukrainians would be eager to accept, considering the history of 20 failed negotiated ceasefires, failed 200 rounds of negotiations, that they can accept Russia on its word that it won't invade again with no defensive pact to stop them. Based in what? That they would get EU economic access? Well, I mean, the Ukrainians want that. That's something they certainly want. They want that EU access. They want the visa access. They want access to the market. But none of that matters if the Russians can just curb stomp them. Because what, they agree to be in the EU, but what if the Russians assert its military dominance over them, knowing no one can come to their assistance to shift them back towards their direction, which they tried to do back in 2014. That's what started the whole Euromaidan movement in the first place. I'm going to just reassert my point I've been saying forever. If you want to break the cycle of violence, you cannot break the cycle of violence of Russia against Ukraine by doing the same things, accepting temporary ceasefire number 21 under the same conditions that built all the other ceasefires, or in this case, even under worse conditions. Because now the Ukrainians, in the potentiality that it breaks apart, that this ceasefire doesn't succeed, what would happen? They'd have nothing to defend themselves but 85,000 men against the second largest military in the world. Why would the Ukrainians, when given a lifeline by the West, not want to accept this deal? Because they had brain cells, probably.